What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today I'm going to be discussing why you should work the scene in street photography. Now, this is one of those tips that I'm giving you today that I believe is one of the reasons why I've had such success with my street photography. And so I'm trying to share the love and the wisdom that I've learned over the years through looking at some of the behind the scenes of my photographs, the contact sheets, discussing some of the ways in which I've personally used this technique of working the scene. So hopefully at the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding about how to work the scene, why you should work the scene, and how this can actually impact your street photography. And so I want you to live by this mantra: don't leave the scene. Let the scene leave you. A lot of the times, the best photographs come through patience and persistence and waiting for the scene to naturally unfold. And so when you're out there on the streets, one must not only be observant and fast like a hunter, but you must also be patient and aware and in the moment. And so today we're going to be talking about something that I believe is the single most important practice in street photography: working the scene. It's a mindset, it's a philosophy, it's a way of being out there and operating in the world. I think ultimately working the scene is a really simple technique to improving your street photography. And so what does it mean to work the scene? Essentially, working the scene is the antithesis of just pressing the shutter once and moving on, right? It's where you follow through and you squeeze everything out of the scene. You spend time at a scene, you change your angle and look again and photograph and readjust your body. Because ultimately the result of the composition derives through your intuition, that moment you press the shutter. But that moment you press the shutter isn't necessarily going to come one and done. It's going to come through you adjusting your body at the scene, moving physically, and then pressing the shutter. And so what I want to emphasize here is the simple fact that one must relate their physical body in relationship to the scene and the background to come home with a compelling photograph. And so here you can see the behind the scenes contact sheet from this photograph I made in Zambia, Africa during my 2-year Peace Corps service, where I was working in a rural village living amongst the Bemba tribe. And so I waited outside of the Seventh-day Adventist church camp, and I was patient and observant. And this was actually the first time I arrived at the church. And as I assessed the scene, I looked at the way in which this beautiful brick wall and the blue stripe painted across the church, with these geometric shapes and formal elements could combine to create a strong photo. And so what I did was I positioned myself at a choke point where people are coming in and out of the scene. And by positioning yourself at these choke points, you can set your stage. And so essentially by angling my physical body in relationship to these different structures, these doorways, these walls, and the people, of course, gave me a clean background to work with. And so a lot of the times I like to find myself at a choke point where I know that there's a potential photograph to make, where I know that people are coming in and out of the church, as this is before church has started. And so people are outside waiting before Mass. And so at this scene, we have various figures placed all throughout the frame. And as you can see, I layered this photograph from the foreground to the middle ground and the background using the layering technique by working the scene. And by working the scene and adjusting my body gradually, those micro movements and adjustments relating myself to the subjects and the background come together and form this composition through me being there and being present and not leaving the scene. I could totally sense the possibility of something occurring here by simply waiting and observing and understanding these different formal relationships between that brick wall, between that doorway, between the blue stripe and the blue sky, and of course the people upon the street. And so as I sat there and I waited and I stood there with my camera, I was making these relationships gradually by moving and physically being there and being present and essentially letting the chips fall together naturally without necessarily forcing anything. I was simply patient and observant and allowed the people in the frame to sort of fall together in place. And so I believe that there's a myth of the decisive moment where we romanticize this notion of the decisive moment where a great moment or a great photograph is taken with one click. But ultimately, most great shots are built with 10, 20, 50, or even hundreds of frames at the scene. And so I believe that patience is the price of these great and impactful photographs that you see here. And so as I observed this scene in Zambia, Africa, once again, during my Peace Corps service, it was the beautiful golden hour. These children were playing upon this empty frame, and it was a fantastic scene, and I was observant at the scene. And I followed through with consistency and patience, and I could sense something occurring here due to the light and shadow play, due to the youth playing upon the frame. And so I essentially followed through by making lots of photographs as the children are out of my control, the light is out of my control, lots of things are moving and changing very rapidly here at the scene. And we only have that fleeting moment of the golden hour with these long looming shadows. And so one must be patient and work with speed simultaneously. And here we have a context sheet where you see I made the successful photograph very early on, but I continuously pressed the shutter and made a lot more adjustments and a lot more photographs following through, because ultimately I didn't leave this scene until the scene left me. I didn't stop photographing until I basically didn't see any more potential photographs to make. And then ultimately, through being there and being patient and observant, I was able to put order to the chaos, right? Where the serendipity, the spontaneity is essentially out of our control. And this is very difficult to sort of put order to as a street photographer, where light is out of your control. And so in order to put order to the light, one must be patient. And the delightful response or the delightful result of this photograph is the gesture of the boy's eye and that gaze sort of peering out beyond the shadow there in relationship to the shadow play on the right-hand side of the frame from the girl. And this came through patience. This came through working the scene. This came through me pressing the shutter multiple times and working diligently. And as you could see in that long contact sheet, I made lots of photographs. I stayed patient. I adjusted my body. I got close. I moved back. And I initially was drawn to this scene, not only for the energy of the children playing, but because of the light. Right? And so by observing the light here at the scene, I was able to add that extra layer and have this mysterious frame evoke a sense of, a sense of the scene. Like the scene, to me, isn't necessarily just the children playing, but it's that scorching hot sun from this, Zambian village in Africa. That to me was the subject. I follow the light mostly, and I find potential in certain scenes due to the light a lot of the times. And so working the scene here required patience, and it required me to essentially just be there and be present and make lots of photographs. And so I believe that working the scene matters. You have to earn these photographs ultimately. These kind of images that you're seeing here don't just come with, a one and done snapshot, but ultimately I spend a lot of times in different communities to make these photographs, where working the scene, I believe, goes beyond this notion of simply being there at a particular moment and pressing the shutter, but spending time at a scene can require 2 weeks. For instance, here I was spending 2 weeks sleeping under thatched roofs in a Seventh-day Adventist church camp. And at the end of the event, after 2 weeks, baptisms emerged at the lake, and I was out there at the scene with my water up to my knees deep, and I came home with the photograph of the baptism. And so essentially I immersed myself in this experience out there in the open world, and over this 2-week journey of me photographing and experiencing this Seventh-day Adventist church camp, I came home with this photograph of the baptism. And this is something I didn't predict or didn't know, but through actually immersing myself in this culture, immersing myself in this experience, I was then able to work this particular scene and come home with the photograph of the baptism. And so as I work this particular scene of the baptism, you can see that I'm looking down at the top of the contact sheet, photographing as the man is dunking the man in the water. However, what I realized very quickly was the gesture of the preacher and the way that he raises his hand up into the sky. And so recognizing that gesture and recognizing that decisive moment required my physical body in relationship to that moment to change. And so I dropped low and photographed looking up towards the preacher, towards the subjects in my frame, against that blue sky to emphasize that gesture. And so by moving my body and waiting for that gesture, I was able to put order to the chaos of this frame. And this came through me being extremely patient. This came through me being hyper aware of the patterns of human behavior, of the way in which people are moving and gesturing at the scene, and recognizing the moment that matters most. And so by recognizing that gesture and waiting for it, I was able to come home with this photograph that has a very striking emotional impact, where ultimately closeness, I believe, goes beyond the physicality of you being there and being physically close to your subject, but I believe closeness comes through this emotional response to actually engaging with humanity and then uplifting and championing humanity to a new height. And so this is another example from my personal experience. I photographed in Israel and Palestine for many months, and there was an occasion where I wanted to go out there and photograph the looming wall. And so the wall that separates Israel and Palestine. And so you can see me standing on top of the wall. And so, this didn't happen right away, right? I didn't only work the scene in the moment, similar to that baptism, but I went back to this location time and time again for weeks, if not months, waiting for this moment, waiting for something to occur along the wall. Because against this wall here, there aren't many people. There's a very desolate energy that exists across this vast landscape of the wall that separates Israel and Palestine. And ultimately, by going back there over and over again, over weeks and weeks, I came home with this image. And so, as you can see on this context sheet, one of the things that I want to highlight about the way that I work this particular scene, once again, is the physicality of making the composition, of relating myself to the moment and the background. And of course, we want that long looming wall in the background. That was the thing of interest. However, by making a picture of the wall itself, at this particular angle at the top of the context sheet, you can see that the image falls flat. However, through moving and adjusting my body in relationship to the moment of the boy throwing the baby stroller, I was able to create these strong leading lines. However, I wasn't necessarily looking at this moment in front of me and thinking in my head that, if I move my body, I'll have strong leading lines. I'm simply following my intuition, where composition is intuition, and so you must move your body in order to create these photographs while working the scene. And so while you're working the scene, a pro tip, don't just stand still and photograph the same angle over and over again, but adjust your body, adjust the angle and the relationship between you, the moment, and the background, and that's how you'll come home with a more striking photograph. And this is how to work the scene. It's through moving your physical body. It's how you relate yourself to the moment and the background. This is how a composition is made. It's not made through being so visually aware of the leading lines and the rule of thirds and the triangles and the compositional techniques, but it's you physically responding to life in front of you. And then the composition comes together naturally through your intuition. But this comes through working the scene, through being patient and watching as life unfolds and moving your body in relationship to that subject. And so I believe that you should not necessarily chase moments. A lot of the times it's good to return to the same location over and over again, right? I return to that wall over and over again. Here's a bus stop in Philadelphia, as you can see in this behind the scenes video, that I'm very much patiently photographing. But I return to this location, I return to this bus stop over and over again to make this photograph. It's a very different scene, but I'm still trying to emphasize here the patience required, where I return to these locations and I understand the potential of a photograph to make in these certain locations, right? Where the wall was a potential I could sense, that there's of course a potential photograph to make there. This particular bus stop that you see on the contact sheet, I could sense the possibility of a photograph here, not only due to the way the light strikes at a certain time, but the choke point, the people, and the way that people move in and off of this particular bus stop, was always full of energy. And this is something that I do time and time again when I approach the streets here in my hometown, Philadelphia, is I find locations where I know there's potential. And then I go back there over and over again for weeks at end and then work that scene. And so as I made this photograph, I was treating this photograph in this moment like visual problem solving, where ultimately photography is visual problem solving, and one must relate the different puzzle pieces to create a stronger composition. And so here in this photograph, I was initially drawn to the light. And then by working the scene and staying patient and diligent, I was able to make the different relationships between the light, the shadow play, the silhouette, and the man entering through the center of the frame. But this came through me making these relationships and staying patient and working the scene and making lots of photographs and making micro adjustments and movements to put together the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. This doesn't come with a one and done click of the shutter. This comes through patience and working the scene. Not only am I working the scene in the moment, but once again, I'm returning over and over again to these same locations with persistence and patience for weeks at end. And so I believe that, this practice of working the scene really makes you be present in the moment. And I think this to me is the beauty of working the scene, where you're not rushing anything, but you're simply enjoying the day, you're enjoying your time, and you're watching as life unfolds naturally. And to me, the way in which I engage with humanity reflects back in the photographs I make. And so the way in which I was able to come home with this particular photograph in Jericho of this striking moment of the boy smoking the cigarette was due to me being out there in the world and having a shared experience with these brothers and going on an adventure through the valley here in Jericho and hiking through the desert for hours at end. And at a particular moment during our trip, we were relaxing by the water and this photograph unfolded naturally. This moment occurred very spontaneously. And then I was simply there and prepared with my camera and made the photograph, right? And so by being present and being engaged with life and going on an adventure and being present when you press the shutter, you can increase your ability to create stronger photographs through working the scene. Where ultimately this kind of photography requires courage on the street, where fear is normal, but courage is simply staying there and being present and allowing these different moments to unfold, where you have to kind of hold your space and hold your ground and be there at the moment that this, potential photograph you want to make occurs, right? And so I encourage you to think more about how you can use courage to improve your photography, because ultimately I believe that the photographs we make are a reflection of our courage, right? Where the word courage, core meaning heart, the photograph is a reflection of your heart, of your soul. And so remember that, because ultimately, as much as I can describe to you how to work the scene and how to photograph certain things, I believe that one must possess courage, firstly, in order to go out there onto the front lines of life, to get close to these different moments, to get close to these places and these different things that you want to photograph in order to work the scene. And so stay still, let the world move, shoot through the moment, move your body, try new angles, return to the same spot, and study your contact sheets. I think this is something very critical, because what you'll notice as you look at the photographs you make are certain patterns that emerge and certain ways that you make compositional decisions, certain moments that you're interested in photographing. And so by analyzing your own work, you'll be able to go back out there and improve your street photography. And I believe that working the scene is all about patience. Working the scene is all about presence and being physical and moving your body, adjusting yourself in relationship to the subject and the background. And so never leave the scene. Let the scene leave you. You have to stay there and be patient and trust that the photograph will come naturally. You can't force anything, but you simply want to allow the chips to fall as they may, embracing the spontaneity, embracing the serendipity of the streets, and putting order to the chaos through your presence and your patience. And so these are some of my tips and advice on working the scene in street photography. This really is an important tip. I think that you should try this out in your hometown, wherever you may be. Find choke points. Find places where you can expect energy. Find places where you can expect a little bit of chaos. For me, and particularly in Philadelphia, it's very mundane, right? But at the bus stop, there's lots of different things that go on at the bus stop. People are going on the bus. People are coming off of the bus. People are sitting down on the benches. People are moving in and out of the background. There's something there because, a lot of the times it's hard to find the scene that you want to photograph. You're out there and you're looking for a particular subject, you're looking for something specific. But if you simply find a place where people converge on a street corner, if you simply find a place where people are moving in and out at a marketplace, you'll be able to practice this technique of working the scene. And so I highly encourage you to think more about the choke point. Think more about the place where you can find a potential photograph to make. Think more about where you can position your physical body in relationship to people moving in and out of a scene, and set your stage with a clean background to work with, where working the scene is all about putting together the composition, but it's not necessarily something you force. It's something that comes naturally through being there and being present and patient and allowing the moment to unfold naturally. And so these are some of my tips once again. I hope that some of these tips have helped you and will help you improve your photography through working the scene out there on the streets. And so with that being said, thank you for watching today's video, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.